Tonight, as you may know, this is the third of our four-part series on the Paramis. And to quickly review, the Paramis are 10 wholesome qualities of character that the Buddha encouraged us to develop. 2 weeks ago, Joy provided an overview of the Paramis, and she addressed the first, which is generosity. Last week, Thea addressed the second, third, and fourth Paramis, which are virtue, renunciation, and wisdom. This evening, I'll address the fifth, sixth, and seventh, which are energy, patience, and truthfulness. And then next week, we'll conclude with the last three, which are determination, loving kindness, and equanimity. Let me just mention that last week, when Thea gave her talk, if you were on Zoom, the audio was not very good. And so Thea has generously re-recorded her talk. It's not on the website yet, but it will be in the next few days. So if you either couldn't understand it or if you missed it, you can go listen to it on the website. So, Parami number 5, energy. The Pali word is virya. So the other day I saw a cartoon of a person lying on the couch and they have this little thought bubble over their head. You know how cartoons do that. And it said, "I'm not lazy, I'm just in energy saving mode." So I think most of us can identify with that feeling. So is that okay sometimes to be in energy saving mode, or should we instead, as they say, always be practicing like our hair is on fire? Striking the right balance with energy can be a challenge. So the trait of energy pervades the Buddha's teachings. In addition to being one of the Paramis, it's also one of the 5 spiritual faculties, one of the 4 bases of power, one of the 7 factors of awakening, and it has a very close relationship to the Noble Eightfold Path, specifically the path factor of right effort. So it sounds like somebody thought this energy thing was really important, right? The proximate cause, or the principal cause of energy, is understood to be spiritual urgency. And the Pali word for that, in case you're interested in such things, is samvega. The idea is that we have experienced great good fortune to have been born into this human condition at this time. So I think this merits just a moment of attention, because it's quite important, I think. The best estimate I could find is that there are about 8 billion humans on the planet. And there are about 20 quintillion, that is billion animals. And so that means that out of every 10 billion births, 4 are human. So that's pretty fortunate. And it's particularly excellent news because it is understood that only a human can achieve awakening. So if we don't have the good fortune of being born into the human condition, we don't have the opportunity to awaken. But even that hasn't always guaranteed us a shot. Over the ages, the written word, we read the Dharma. The written word was not in common use. And even when it started showing up, most people were illiterate. They couldn't read. To hear the Dharma, one would have to be born in a location where they could travel to hear a teacher. And you would have to have the money to travel, and you'd have to be able to take time away from feeding and protecting yourself and your family to do that. And then you'd have to have the time to study and practice. And finally, you'd have to be born when the Dharma is available. So if you were born 2,700 years ago, you're out of luck. because the Dharma only was presented by the Buddha 2,600 years ago. So great good fortune indeed that we have. And as a result, it's incumbent upon us to use the rare opportunity we have to pursue our spiritual development. Sylvia Boorstein said, "Knowing that I don't have a moment to lose keeps my energy high." And I find these words from Bhikkhu Bodhi helpful. He said, "The Buddha does what he can by pointing out the path to liberation. The rest involves putting the path into practice, a task that demands, guess what? Energy. This energy is to be applied in the cultivation of the mind, which forms the focus of the entire path. The starting point is a defiled mind, afflicted and deluded. The goal is the liberated mind, purified and illuminated by wisdom. What comes in between is the unremitting effort to transform the defiled mind into the liberated mind." And when he talks about the unremitting effort, he's talking about applying energy. But a proper relationship with energy is not simply that more is better. In the teaching on the hindrances, 2 of the 5 hindrances relate to energy. Sloth and torpor represent energy at a level that is too low. Restlessness and worry represent too much energy. And so the task is to strike some kind of an optimal balance. I want to just share a quick story, and it's, I'm not going to read the whole sutta, but it's the Sona Sutta. The Buddha is talking to one of his followers named Sona. And Sona, before he became a monk, he played the lute. And so the Buddha says to him, "What do you think? When the strings of your lute were too tight, was your lute in a playable condition?" And he said, "Well, no, it wasn't." And then he says, "Well, what do you think? When the strings of your lute were too loose, was it in a playable condition?" He says, "Well, no, it was not." And he says, the Buddha says, "But now what do you think? When the strings of your lute were neither too tight nor too loose, but tuned to the right pitch, was it in a playable condition?" He says, "Yes, it was." The Buddha says, "In the same way, Soma, over-aroused persistence leads to restlessness. Overly slack persistence leads to laziness. Thus, you should determine the right pitch for your persistence, attune the pitch, and there pick up your feet." And guess what happened after that? Sona went off and practiced, and he became enlightened. So, sounds pretty easy. So have you ever spent, talking about energy, have you ever spent most of your meditation period with a very active mind, finding it hard to attend to the breath? Then, maybe sometimes in the last few minutes, your mind will finally settle. And there's this beautiful peacefulness that you have access to. So I want you to think about the sensation that occurs when that relaxation occurs. I want to suggest that it's the experience of resistance falling away. So I had the good fortune to attend a retreat on the Paramis taught by Christina Feldman at the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies. She's quite a teacher. One of her statements that I remember is, "Resistance consumes energy." Now that makes sense once somebody says it, but I needed for her to say it. So when we're meditating with an active, unruly mind, most often the thoughts are around demanding things be other than the way they are. Maybe we're remembering a conversation where we wish we'd said something different. Or maybe we're telling ourselves a story about how we want things to be in the future. Maybe it's the temperature in the room or sounds or some physical sensation. But a great deal of our mental activity is really resistance. When the moment of release comes, when we stop resisting and drop into a peaceful, mindful presence, the energy drain of resistance stops, and there's energy available for practice, and you can feel the shift. Christina Feldman went on to say, when we don't feel like we have enough energy, look at how much energy we have for craving and ill will. I don't know about you, but I don't even like to look at that. It's too disturbing. Finally, summoning the necessary energy and regulating it to some optimal level can be a challenge. Just remember that no moment is wasted on this path. Every instance where we fall short of our aspirations is an opportunity to learn. And these moments are literally the raw materials from which a mature practice is built. So that's a little bit about energy. Let's talk about patience. I saw a t-shirt the other day that said, I had my patience tested and I was negative. So who among us hadn't had that feeling? That we simply are not endowed with the trait of patience. The 5th or 6th century Theravada monk, Ayyakarya Dhammapala, in his treatise on the Paramis, defines patience as the endurance of harm imposed by beings and formations, or the act of consciousness occurring in such mode, predominated by non-aversion and accompanied by compassion and skillful means. You don't have to recite all that. The proximate cause of patience is understood to be seeing things as they really are. And that is precisely the definition of vipassana that I see used most often, seeing things as they really are. As we cultivate our insight meditation practice, and as we gain clarity in how we see the world, patience arises as a natural result. Now, while I resonate with the first term in that definition, endurance, the endurance of harm, the idea of harm, the second term, harm being imposed feels, I don't know, it doesn't feel quite accurate to me. You know, the Buddha said, come and see for yourself. And when I find myself impatient, the feeling is one of kind of knowing better than the other person what needs to be done and wanting them to stop hindering me from doing it. I don't experience it as harm being imposed on me, although, I don't know, maybe there is an element of that. So maybe impatience occurs in traffic when somebody is slow to accelerate after a stoplight, or heaven forbid, unaware of the light changing because they're sending a text. Maybe it's in a line where the person ahead is moving more slowly than we'd like. Sometimes it shows up when we need an answer from someone and they don't respond on our timeline. In these situations, we have a tendency to react impulsively to get what we want. When we cultivate patience, we resist the tendency, we resist these impulsive reactions, and we replace them with actions that arise from our deeper intentions toward kindness and generosity. Gil Fronsdale says it this way: patience entails choosing not to respond reactively, allowing other possibilities to arise. It provides tremendous support for mindfulness practice. So I like the sound of that, allowing other possibilities to arise. Now, when I reflect on impatience, the root cause that comes to my mind is conceit. It's an experience of knowing better than anybody else what should be done or how it should be done. But we really have to be realistic about eliminating this conceit. It's a function of the untrained mind, and we shouldn't despair. Small movements away from conceit toward less conceit. They're really what is available to us, and we shouldn't discount them. As we see impatience arise, what we can do is challenge the feeling of superiority. Is it true that I know better? Maybe there's a reason for this delay that I don't know or appreciate. When we allow other possibilities to arise, the impatience can subside. So I learned a lesson 2 or 3 decades ago when both of my parents were in their late 60s, my present age. And after this, I found it easier to be patient with them. And I think that helped me be patient with on a broader way. We were coming back from a doctor's appointment, and my father was driving. He was in the early stages of dementia, but he was still safe to drive. And it was really important to him to do as much as he could, retain as much function as he could. And this teenager in a fast car, which was probably me 50 years ago, raced up behind us and rode our bumper until he could get around us. And then he raced around us blowing the horn. And what I saw was the hurtful impact that experience had on them, and it surprised me. I knew impatience is unpleasant for the person that's experiencing it. But when I saw the suffering that it inflicted on others, that opened my eyes a little bit. And since then, when I'm in traffic behind a slower driver, I will often find myself, I don't have to make a decision and do this on purpose. I naturally visualize my father driving that slow car. And the result is that my impatience dissipates and this reservoir of patience becomes available. Now, I understand this to be the working of compassion, one of the 4 Brahma Viharas. By seeing the commonality between our situation and that of others, we're able to experience empathy. And that leads us back to the earlier statement that the proximate cause of patience is seeing things as they really are. The accurate perception of interconnectedness of all beings naturally gives rise to patience. And I want to say one more thing about patience. A second equally important result of seeing things as they are is the awareness of unreliability or impermanence. While things may be frustrating in this moment, they will and must change. And this is one of the 3 foundational characteristics of existence taught by the Buddha. The more I truly integrate this truth into my life, the more patience naturally arises. So, truthfulness, the third of the 3 that we're going to speak about tonight. My friend David once said, I can keep a secret. The problem is nobody I tell can keep a secret. And this statement is funny because it reveals on its face that he was not telling the truth when he agreed to keep the secret in the first place, but he was critical of others because they did the same thing. So truthfulness can be a challenge, and we know that from just looking at the world around us. The proximate cause of truthfulness is understood to be honesty. When we are honest, truthful speech naturally follows. Therefore, to cultivate truthfulness, we should cultivate honesty. The most familiar of the Buddhist teachings on truthfulness probably comes from the Noble Eightfold Path, specifically the path factor of right speech. Here, the guidance is to avoid 4 specific types of speech: lies, that is, words spoken with the intent of misrepresenting the truth. Second, divisive speech, spoken with the intent of creating rifts between people. Third, harsh speech, spoken with the intent of hurting another person's feelings. And fourth, idle chatter, spoken with no purposeful intent at all. And if you note, each of these four types of unskillful speech are described with the term intent. The parami of truthfulness doesn't encompass the entirety of right speech. Instead, it focuses on the first of these four types of speech to be avoided, and that's lies. So here is what the Buddha said about false speech. So this is 4 or 5 sentences. It will only take a minute. There is the case where a certain person, abandoning false speech, abstains from false speech. When she has been called to a town meeting, a group meeting, a gathering of her relatives, her guild, or of the royalty, she is asked as a witness, "Come and tell, good woman, what do you know?" If she doesn't know, she says, "I don't know." If she does know, she says, "I know." If she hasn't seen, she says, "I haven't seen." If she has seen, she says, "I have seen." Thus, she doesn't consciously tell a lie for her own sake, or for the sake of another, or for the sake of any reward. Abandoning false speech, she abstains from false speech. She speaks the truth, holds to the truth, is firm, reliable, no deceiver of the world. So lies can take many forms, and they each have their own consequences. One thing that we're familiar with is people who exhibit the trait of pathological lying. And that's really a psychological disorder that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about tonight. Another is a lie that is an intentionally false statement. Now, usually intentional lies are used to gain advantage for oneself or another. Going back to the intention again, this is Bhikkhu Bodhi. The determinative factor behind the transgression is the intention to deceive. If one speaks something false, believing it to be true, there is no breach of the precept, as the intention to deceive is absent. The underlying motive is most often greed. For example, I might find a wallet when I sit down in a restaurant, and I tuck it in my pocket, and then somebody comes back and says, "Did you find a wallet?" I said, "No, I didn't find a wallet." And the reason I do that is to advantage myself by keeping what was in the wallet. That kind of intentional lying carries a pretty heavy burden of karma, but it's one of the less complex types of lies. Now, a more complex type occurs when we mistake the facts because we misperceive the truth. For example, I may really wish that my child was hardworking. So I believe this in the face of all evidence to the contrary. And this represents a combination of willful denial and genuine ignorance. And parsing out the truth there, what's what, can require some effort. But we need to invest that effort. Our commitment to insight and wisdom represents our commitment to do just that. Then there's the case of the little white lie. Here, the speaker believes the lie is justified, often to avoid hurting somebody's feelings. So the intention to prevent hurt is wholesome, but often it's how it's phrased. Often little white lies are needed, or we feel like they're needed, because we're in a circumstance where we're given a false choice between hurting somebody or telling the truth. And usually if we see that in the moment, we can reframe it so that it's not a false choice and we can both tell the truth and avoid hurt. am running out of time, but I've got two more things I want to say. It can be really hard in the moment to respond with complete honesty. And one valuable tool is to delay responding. One thing we can do is we can say, well, let me just think about that for a moment. Another thing we can do is say, I'll need to think about that and get back to you. And that can feel awkward in the moment when we first start, but once we develop that practice, it really is kind of a relief. When I was practicing as a CPA, I had a mutual client with an attorney, and periodically this attorney and I needed to collaborate to make sure we were coordinating things for this client. And this was a challenging client. This person was used to having their way. And on one occasion, when I was talking with the attorney, what the client told us, each of us was diametrically opposed. And I still remember her reaction when we discovered this. She said, man, she said, this really stinks. She said, now I have to work so much harder. When I know that I can't trust what a client tells me, the effort to do my job increases exponentially. And I've always remembered that comment, and I think it's true. Engaging in untruthfulness burdens others with the need to question and verify what has been said. In a very real sense, it's a violation of the precept against not stealing. It takes from others an effort that they have not agreed to expend. Alternately, when others know that our words are reliable, the burden is lifted. Chanasara Bhikkhu puts it this way: when you make a practice of truthfulness, your words become a gift to others. So in closing, the paramis of energy, patience, and truthfulness are three of the wholesome qualities of character we're encouraged to cultivate on this path, and tune in next week for the final installment.